April 15, 1912. The first distress rocket tears through the darkness of the North Atlantic. Aboard the four-funneled giant, with her bow slowly sinking after a deadly sideswipe against the ice, despair is already absolute. But just a few miles away, on the deck of another ship, officers watch those flashes in the night and simply fold their arms. The story that this great liner died alone is a lie, because salvation stood barely 50 miles away, watching the tragedy unfold. Before we expose that unforgivable omission, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, if you had been in command of one of those vessels, would you have risked your own crew in the dark to attempt the rescue? That cold, merciless night hides a deeply disturbing truth, one recorded on navigation charts with an almost mathematical chill, revealing details the official story tried to bury for more than a century. The ocean was not, in any sense, the empty, dark, silent void that dramatizations so often portray to heighten the aura of isolation. Quite the opposite. That particular stretch of the North Atlantic was a true bottleneck of heavy maritime traffic, a crowded crossroads of commercial routes packed with ships cutting through the freezing waters, carrying passengers and supplies in every direction. When the steel flank of the towering four-funneled liner scraped fatally against an unseen iceberg in the moonless night, opening lethal fractures that quickly allowed water to rush violently into the boiler rooms, the call for help did not vanish into emptiness. That desperate cry raced through the newly installed waves of wireless telegraphy and slammed into the receivers of multiple ships already there, stopped in the surrounding waters, waiting for dawn with their engines shut down as a precaution against the massive ice fields. Every one of those radio officers, alone on their watches, heard the international distress signal tear through the static in their headphones. They knew with absolute clarity how serious the situation was, only a few miles away, at the very moment the bow of the doomed ship was beginning to yield under the relentless weight of the freezing sea. There was one detail that changes everything we think we know about this tragedy: a lethal mix of excessive bureaucracy, inexcusable hesitation at the highest levels of command, and in some cases, plain selfishness and comfort from the men who held the power to decide, sealed the dark fate of more than 1,500 souls. That silent sentence was passed long before the water ever had the chance to reach the main deck, where the lifeboats were being prepared in mounting desperation. Because when we examine the exact positions and deck logs of every ship in that sleeping neighborhood of sea, we realize that an almost total rescue was not fantasy. It was physically and logistically possible. The convenient story that the disaster was nothing more than an unavoidable blow from nature serves to hide a massive failure in communication and human responsibility. And if you, like us, believe that real history matters and prefer hard analysis over polished myth, feel free to subscribe and leave your like, because your support helps us keep digging up the truth buried in the bottom of the oceans. Now get ready to understand, step by step, how this invisible web of ships, fully capable of carrying out the greatest rescue operation in history, became a map of absolute guilt and omission. To understand the true scale of that unforgivable omission, we need to turn the clock back a few hours before the ship's steel side met the lethal rigidity of the ice. The official version often leads us to believe that the disaster was sudden and unpredictable, a cruel stroke of maritime fate. But the technical analysis of communication records from that era proves exactly the opposite. The wireless room was operating at a feverish pace, driven by the deafening sparks of radio equipment that represented the absolute cutting edge of communication at the time. Throughout that Sunday, April 14, 1912, Urgent and formal warnings about enormous ice fields arrived non-stop from virtually every point on the compass. Different ships already crossing the dangerous westbound trade route reported constant sightings of massive floes, towering icebergs, and wide frozen plains that turned the dark ocean into a true death maze for any steel hull attempting the crossing. Wireless communication was still a new and extraordinary tool in the merchant marine, but it demanded intense patience and total focus from operators, who spent long hours wearing heavy headphones, trying to decode Morse through static and the atmospheric interference common to cold northern waters. And it was through those fragmented sounds, carefully translated onto paper in shipboard logs, that the official position map of that fatal night took shape, revealing a scene that remains agonizing to any modern investigator or serious student of naval history. There were not, by any logical reading, just one or two lonely vessels lost in that frozen immensity of the North Atlantic. The historical records from the official inquiries show clearly that several merchant ships, large freighters, and other passenger vessels formed a very real and very tight ring around those exact coordinates. Those surrounding crews, led by officers hardened by the unforgiving laws of the sea, understood perfectly well what that sudden cutting cold, that abrupt drop in air temperature, and that perfectly still surface of water meant in practice. They were facing a natural wall, a hostile territory where the force of nature demanded immediate and unquestioned respect. To make matters worse, the weather conditions that night created a deadly optical illusion. The open sea was astonishingly calm, flat, and polished, like a giant pane of black glass, with no wind and no swell to break against the submerged base of the ice and create the white foam that usually served as a visual warning for sailors on moonless nights. It was absolute darkness, heavy and complete, a continuous void where the stars above blended seamlessly into the endless black horizon of deep water. And that is precisely why the ships nearby were so emphatic in the messages they sent by telegraph during the day and into the evening. They were not reporting harmless loose chunks of ice, but a vast frozen continent drifting freely at sea. Faced with that dangerous and potentially lethal scenario, the senior officers commanding those neighboring vessels made the most sensible and prudent decision in all of commercial navigation. When darkness finally swallowed the last light of the sun, wiping out any safe margin of visibility, they gave the immediate and irrevocable order to stop their engines completely. The massive steam machines, which had been pushing thousands of tons of steel through ocean routes, were cautiously brought to silence. Those ships lay still, floating in patient suspension on the calm water, waiting for the redeeming light of morning to reveal a safe passage through that dense minefield, protecting above all the lives of their crews and passengers. But there was one crucial and devastating detail that broke completely with this silent, collective choreography of caution, a detail marked by a confidence so unshakable it would weigh forever in the verdict of history. The giant luxury liner with 4 funnels was the only ship to solemnly ignore the strict prudence embraced by all her peers in that same danger zone. Driven by blind faith in her advanced design and her celebrated watertight compartments, and possibly by the silent commercial pressure to maintain a flawless arrival schedule in the United States, the steel mechanical heart of that immense vessel kept beating without hesitation. The engine room remained fed without pause. Firemen, covered in sweat and black soot, pushing the edge of human exhaustion in the deepest, hottest, loudest levels of the hull, kept shoveling tons of coal into the roaring furnaces to maintain dangerous maximum boiler pressure. The mathematical and irreversible result of that overreaching ambition was the reckless maintenance of a speed of nearly 21 knots, cutting through total darkness like a brightly lit steel spear, driving straight toward a lethal threat that had already been documented, mapped, and warned about over and over during the crucial hours before the disaster. And it was in that grim context of operational stubbornness in the face of nature that the inevitable took on its most terrifying physical form. When the exhausted lookouts, high above in their freezing posts, working in brutal conditions and without the basic help of binoculars to scan the uncertain horizon, finally spotted the massive, deadly shadow of the iceberg looming ahead, it was already physically impossible to avoid the encounter. The problem is that the resulting collision was not a massive head-on impact that would have brought the ship to an immediate halt and concentrated the damage high above. It was, in fact, a violent and lethal scraping blow along the starboard side. The crushing friction of that ancient wall of ice against the ship's heavy, riveted steel plates acted like an invisible surgical blade far below the safe waterline. That long, deep wound opened the vulnerable seams of several vital lower compartments at once, allowing the freezing waters of the North Atlantic to pour silently and mercilessly into the boiler rooms and lower quarters. From that tragic and irreversible instant forward, the pride and brilliance of modern engineering lost their battle against the laws of physics and the merciless gravity of a sinking ship. The absurd additional weight of the thousands of tons of freezing water flooding steadily into the forward section guaranteed that the majestic bow would be pulled down into the dark depths. It would catastrophically overload the vessel's central steel structure, inevitably culminating in the brutal structural break that tore the ship dramatically in two, moments before the immense hull began its final near-vertical plunge by the stern into the oblivion of the ocean floor, ending its first and last voyage in horror. And that changes everything we think we know, or were taught to believe, about the terrifying true dynamics of that night of unmatched loss. The deepest and most disturbing aspect of the entire tragedy lies in the painful and undeniable realization of the exact geographic point where that mighty steel colossus was mortally torn open. Once she lost the driving force of her steam engines and began to settle forward, slowly and agonizingly, under the paralyzing cold and the cutting wind of that silent early morning, the proud luxury liner was not dying alone, far from civilized shipping lanes, in some empty ocean desert. In a bitter and infuriating irony, the wounded giant was sinking in the very center of a silent, sleeping neighborhood of sea, entirely surrounded by sturdy ships standing still and safe through their own professional caution. Commanders and potential rescue crews rested only a few miles away, protected by the inertia of their own cold engines, strategically positioned on that frozen chessboard of water and fully equipped to carry out a life-saving approach if they had simply chosen to act. The crystal-clear chance for a broad rescue, one that could have spared more than 1,000 innocent lives, did not depend on crossing unknown currents or waiting for a miracle from distant ports. It required something far simpler and far more tragic. It required any authority in that silent neighborhood to break through the deadly barrier of conformity, relight the furnaces, and turn their propellers toward the obvious human desperation now lighting up the black horizon of the frozen Atlantic. To understand the outer limit of negligence on that freezing morning, we need to briefly turn our eyes away from the four-funneled giant, sting dangerously by the bow, and focus on a silent presence lying less than 20 miles away. Case of this nearby freighter, the vessel that would go down in history as a true ghost ship, goes beyond the limits of command error. The atmospheric conditions of that night created a peculiar kind of visibility. The intense cold, the absence of wind, and the perfectly mirrored sea made the darkness fuse ocean and sky into one, creating the illusion that the stars were touching the water. In that stillness, the giant vessel in trouble stood out on the horizon like a floating city. With all her majestic decks brightly illuminated by electricity, generated deep in the engine spaces, the liner offered a monumental contrast against the blackness. If we pause for a moment and picture the scene, we see it clearly. On one side, the wounded giant glowing on the black ocean. On the other, the quiet silhouette of a ship at rest. The freighter's sailors, watching with unprotected eyes and no binoculars, observed with growing unease as that colossus approached and then stopped. But what turned that visual oddity into an undeniable emergency was the moment the black sky was torn open by the first of a series of white rockets. In the strict universal language of the sea, a white rocket fired alone before dawn leaves very little room for doubt. It is the cry of a vessel that knows its structural end is near, and that thousands of lives depend on outside intervention. When those flares began to rise again and again, the freighter's lookouts rushed the warning to the captain's quarters with urgent alarm. The response from the highest authority aboard, the one man with the power to launch the greatest maritime rescue in history, was marked by a lethargy that borders on the criminal. Irritated at being awakened, the captain made catastrophic choices, and there was one detail of technical negligence that makes the whole thing even worse. Instead of ordering the immediate wake-up of the wireless operator, who was sleeping only a few feet away and could have clarified the situation in seconds, the captain chose an archaic measure. He ordered the use of a simple Morse signal lamp, a tool with extremely limited range, to try to establish contact across the dark. The weak flashes of that lamp were mercilessly swallowed by distance and by the chaos already unfolding on the decks of the sinking ship. The lack of response should have triggered immediate action, but comfort spoke louder. Ignoring the increasingly urgent warnings from his own crew about the continuing rockets, the captain calmly turned over in his warm bunk and went back to sleep, sealing off his conscience from the catastrophe burning just beyond the darkness. The monstrous inertia of one man carried an incalculable cost in empty places that would remain forever unfilled in the lifeboats. And that changes everything we were taught to believe. While the majestic giant was losing her structural battle, breaking apart with a deafening roar before slipping under, salvation lay motionless and shamefully useless, little more than an hour away by sea. The ghost ship remained still, proving that the deadliest obstacle that night was not the invisible ice, but the untouched coldness of the human heart. If cowardly omission silently sealed the fate of hundreds of lives less than 20 miles away, the scene unfolded very differently farther out, in the deep darkness of that merciless ocean. Exactly 50 miles from the point where the deadly sideswipe had doomed the four-funneled colossus, the radio equipment of a merchant vessel picked up the absolute desperation pulsing through the telegraph signals. In that cramped cabin, thick with the smell of ozone from electrical sparks, the radio operator widened his eyes as he translated the continuous Morse. It confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the greatest ship ever built by man was sinking rapidly by the bow in the frozen Atlantic. Without hesitating for a single second, the message was rushed to the captain's quarters. Unlike the criminal lethargy we saw aboard the other freighter, this senior officer instantly showed the true essence of maritime honor. He ordered an immediate and extraordinarily dangerous maneuver for nighttime conditions. He had off-watch firemen shaken awake, ordered the great furnaces relit to build maximum steam pressure, and swung his heavy ship in a hard turn, driving the engines to their limit toward the exact rescue coordinates. At this crucial point in our story, picture the grand outside scene, the mirrored water being torn apart by the bow of this brave rescue ship, while her funnels hurled thick smoke into the starlit sky. The captain stared through the wet glass of his dark bridge, searching for any distant glow. But there was one terrifying detail that would change the course of this heroic mission forever. As the engines thundered at full power, the exhausted lookouts, battling the cutting wind and struggling through the total absence of binoculars in the absolute dark, cried out with a desperate warning. They had not come upon scattered bits of ice. They had run straight into a colossal physical wall that had appeared out of nowhere. A massive, dense, irregular ice field completely blocked the rescue ship's path. It was a floating continental barrier, silent and impassable, rising between the men racing to help and the sinking liner just beyond. Faced with imminent impact, the captain was painfully forced to order all engines stopped, reversing the giant propellers with brute force to keep his own steel hull from suffering an irreparable rupture. And it was in that suffocating moment that the true peak of psychological torture set in. They were halted at the edge of that white abyss, close enough to receive, with growing intensity, the chaos arriving non-stop through the invisible waves of radio. The telegraph was now spitting out messages soaked in unmistakable panic, reporting that freezing water was already washing over the deck where the inadequate lifeboats were being launched. The officers of the rescue ship could hear death closing in on thousands of passengers, but they were physically and structurally unable to cross that immense frozen wall without sacrificing their own crew. To force a path through the ice would have been maritime suicide. Nature itself had created a massive exclusion zone, forcing willing men to stand as helpless spectators in the dark, turning the radio room into a sanctuary of anticipated grief and burning frustration. And that tragically rewrites the logistics of that night. The fatal failure lay not only in the shameful inaction of those who were much closer, but also in the merciless physical barrier imposed by the laws of nature. The real problem, however, the one that would deepen the chain of fatal errors before dawn, was that at the very moment when hundreds of lives depended on every fraction of a second of clear communication, a bitter clash of professional ego began to exact its deadly and silent price in the middle of the electric chaos. As the freezing water of the North Atlantic climbed relentlessly through the lower decks, swallowing the boiler rooms and sealing the fate of the four-funneled Colossus, another kind of tragedy was unfolding in the ship's electrical heart. The wireless room became the stage for petty friction. To understand the root of that conflict, we need to remember the commercial nature of wireless communication in the early 20th century. These operators were not military men drilled to endure absolute crisis. They were civilian employees of a private company whose main job was to satisfy the constant communication demands of the financial elite traveling in the luxurious first-class lounges. Hours before the proud ship's steel side violently tore against that invisible wall of ice, the atmosphere inside that tiny, sweltering cabin was already one of extreme nervous exhaustion. The senior telegraphist, working at the very edge of his physical endurance under the light of a single electric lamp, was completely overloaded by a mountain of commercial dispatches and frivolous personal messages. Bankers were sending urgent buy orders. Magnates were closing million-dollar deals in mid-ocean. And it was in that thick climate of chronic stress that the lethal seed of omission took root. When the operator of a nearby ship tried to break into that non-stop flow in order to pass along an official and vital warning about heavy ice directly ahead on the route, the response sent from the four-funneled giant became infamous. He was told, in effect, to shut up and clear the line because he was interfering with the profitable traffic of the richest passengers on Earth. The problem is that the ocean had a brutal irony waiting for the men so focused on the business value of telegraph paper. When the fatal sideswipe finally came in the darkness below, and the immense steel hull began to yield and dip forward, the value of all that virtual money instantly fell to zero. The senior captain hurried into the radio cabin, visibly pale, carrying on his shoulders the weight of his crew's approaching death. In a firm voice, he ordered all civilian and private communications cut off at once. He commanded that the universal distress signal be sent out with every bit of power the failing boilers could still provide. The modern equipment suddenly became the only invisible rope connecting those thousands of terrified souls to the hope of the wider world in the black depth of the icy Atlantic. That anguished international call for help, loaded with visceral panic in every frantic strike on the copper key, echoed sharply through the early hours. Among the many ships that heard it, A large German passenger vessel was listening in. The disciplined wireless operator aboard that ship, positioned at a distance that calm seas still made manageable, received every desperate spark with crystal clarity. Yet at a time when rigid international emergency protocols were still in their infancy and language barriers were formidable, he did not immediately grasp the full lethality of what he was hearing. Following an old formal procedure, he used his key to request clarification. He asked the other vessel to explain its exact situation before he dared wake his own captain and trigger the costly relighting of the steam boilers. And it was at that suffocating instant when calm reason and iron composure should have ruled the moment and saved trapped lives, that blind human arrogance drove the final nail into the disaster. The exhausted wireless team aboard the giant liner, losing emotional control as they heard the terrible sound of water invading the corridors outside, lost their professionalism as well. Instead of drafting a cold, technical reply that described the terrifying damage in the steel and left no doubt that immediate rescue was needed, the young operators chose the worst possible path. They answered over the airwaves with open insults, impatient and dripping with a contempt that had no place in that moment. They attacked the competence of the frightened colleague, listening in shock from across the water. It was a barrage of abuse sent in Morse, fury fueled by terror in the face of freezing death, but also by that old sense of superiority held by those who believed they commanded the world's great roots. And that completely changes what we know about the real chances of salvation that night. That childish and useless argument shattered, in a profoundly irresponsible way, the precious minutes that could have launched a massive rescue operation. Every second wasted, there carried the literal weight of a beating heart and a life slipping away. If we pause again and look outward into the night, the external image is terrifying. The once immaculate ship, with her 4 proud funnels, was now heavily listing. Her huge bow was being swallowed slowly and painfully by the abyss, while the sea devoured luxury and hope alike, proving in the harshest possible way that human vanity can be every bit as cold, lethal, and merciless as the ice itself. The final salvation of that tragic morning did not come from the sturdy ships lying motionless just a few miles away. True maritime heroism came from a liner much farther out, sailing exactly 58 miles from the disaster. The Carpathia was under the command of a man who simply did not know the meaning of hesitation. When the distress signal ripped through the radio static, her experienced captain did not waste a single second demanding bureaucratic clarification. He took full control and issued bold orders that turned his passenger ship into a race machine against time. But there was one astonishing detail in that maneuver, one that seems almost unthinkable. To guarantee extreme speed beyond the ship's own intended performance, the captain ordered the immediate shutdown of central heating in every passenger cabin. Icy air flooded the corridors because every ounce of steam pressure produced by the boilers had to be redirected to the engines. Deep below, the firemen hurled coal at a frantic pace, making the old hull tremble dangerously. While nearby commanders slept the sleep of omission, this courageous crew drove forward through the heavy darkness of the North Atlantic. On the silent bridge, the captain faced the cutting night wind with stoic calm, trusting only the instinctive skill of his lookouts. These men worked with the naked eye, completely without binoculars, skimming past ancient icebergs by the narrowest margins. The problem is that all that Herculean effort ran up against the unstoppable force of gravity. While the rescue ship devoured the final miles, the proud 4-funneled giant was losing her last structural battle. With the immense bow irreversibly submerged in the freezing water, the heavy stern lifted high into the icy air. Under unbearable mechanical stress, and with a deafening roar of torn metal, the unsinkable ship broke dramatically in two, beginning her final dark plunge into the abyss below. The pale morning light finally illuminated the mirrored sea. The exhausted rescue ship found only funeral silence and a handful of drifting lifeboats. Thousands of souls had perished in those still waters, condemned not only by the lethality of nature, but by the unforgivable cowardice of sleeping ships. When the pale light of morning finally tore through the darkness of the North Atlantic, the scene revealed to the rescue crew was one of overwhelming desolation. The mirror-still sea was tragically strewn with floating wreckage and a heavy funerary silence. The majestic, four-funneled giant, once the supreme jewel of modern engineering, now lay shattered in the deep. The few lifeboats, overloaded with shocked survivors fighting the cold, rocked gently as they waited for the approach of the only ship in the world that had dared drive her boilers hard in the dark to attempt the rescue. But there was one deeper historical detail that would rise far above the visual grief of that ocean. The real battle over the shadowed truth of this catastrophe was only beginning. In the government inquiries that followed almost immediately in America and Europe, investigators tried to piece together the complex puzzle of that fatal morning. And it was in those crowded hearing rooms, under the harsh pressure of the press, that the hidden official map of telegraphic navigation was reconstructed and shown to the world. What it revealed shocked humanity. Authorities and the stunned public discovered that the accepted story of a solitary accident in a vast watery desert was little more than a deeply offensive smokescreen. Through the hard evidence preserved on Morse paper rolls, the world heard for the first time the echoes of a petty battle of egos operating in the shadows. It was judicially established that the vital lines of communication, the very lines that could have coordinated an entire fleet for a mass rescue, had been clogged by rudeness and childish disputes. Civilian operators, exhausted from serving the trivial financial whims of first-class passengers, had prioritized business traffic over urgent warnings about the giant frozen wall waiting in the dark. Vanity and comfort proved, in the most historical sense, to be the true executioners of that night. The sinking of the four-funneled giant must never be remembered as the work of ice alone. The hardest truth is that what unfolded was a tragic failure of human character, surrounded by witnesses who chose omission over courage. The invisible block certainly caused the deadly sideswipe below the surface, but it was the selfish decisions made in the comfort of nearby ships that finally sealed the condemnation of thousands in the freezing waters before dawn. And that changes the entire story we have been taught for more than a century. The proud Colossus did not die in an isolated ocean desert because the lights of potential rescuers were shining clearly across the black horizon. White rockets split the sky, begging for help, but with the lone noble exception of that distant heroic crew who risked their own safety in the dark, the naval elite chose to remain still in a silence of breathtaking cowardice. The great question that still echoes across the untouched waters of the North Atlantic is not about the merciless fury of the sea, but about the dark omission of men. Did the commander who turned over and ignored those flares deserve prison? Or should the blame be shared by every senior officer who simply stood by and did nothing? Leave your verdict in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep uncovering, together, the great hidden truths of our history.